Most of us can't even name them. We can't name our state representative, our state senator. We oftentimes can't name our U.S. congressman. We can usually name a president and a governor, but underneath that, we begin to quickly be ignorant of those people. We need to be praying for them. You know, the world says if you don't vote, don't complain. Well, I think Christians ought to be held to a little bit higher standard. I think we can say if you don't pray for them, don't complain. I know that's not a very popular message, but I believe that's what the Bible is teaching here. We need to pray for them, for their salvation, for their spiritual growth if they're Christians. Either their salvation or for their spiritual growth. We need to pray for their families. We need to pray for them to walk humbly before God. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our politicians walked humbly before God? But do you pray to that end? We are to intercede for our elected officials. Secondly, we are to influence the salt and light. Turn to Matthew chapter number 5. I have it up here on the screen again. Familiar passage? I want to begin in verse number 13. Matthew 5:13. You are the salt of the earth. If the salt hath lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and be trodden under the foot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. We are to influence as salt and light. What does that mean? Well, salt, you may know, throughout all of history, was used as a preserving agent. Now, we have modern refrigeration, freezers, things like that we use to preserve our food. But really, for thousands of years, salt was a very important and expensive commodity because it was what was used to preserve food. In fact, the Latin word for salt is where we get our word salary. Salary actually means salt money. Salt was an important element, an important component throughout history. Now we just use it for some seasoning, but it was used to preserve food. It's also used, bakers tell me this, and I can't vouch for this firsthand, but salt is used in bread to keep the yeast from taking over, so to speak, and that bread rising too large. You need salt in there to keep that yeast under control. Now stay with me here for just a second, because what is the application to Christians? Why then are we called salt? Well, we are called salt because we are to preserve. We are to help hold back the corrupting influence of the world. You know, there's a strong corrupting influence on food. If you don't take care of food properly, preserve it properly, it's going to get corrupt in a hurry. Are y'all like us in our family? When we have leftovers, we put them in a plastic container, we put them in the fridge, and then 2 weeks later we throw them out? Why? Because they're all green and fuzzy, you know. Sometimes you put it in the refrigerator and it still goes bad, right? Have you had food go bad in your refrigerator? The corrupting influence on food is so strong and so pervasive, even though we take steps to prevent that, sometimes it still takes over. Well, look, that's important to apply as we consider preserving and holding back the corruption in our society. Because sometimes we're not particularly successful. Sometimes the corruption is so strong that it still takes over, but that does not absolve us of the responsibility to be salt, holding back the corrupting influence of the world. The idea of yeast. Yeast in the Bible, in the King James Version, you know what the word is instead of yeast? It's leaven. And leaven in the Bible is a picture of what? It's a picture of sin. That's exactly right. And we as Christians, being salt, are to hold back the sin that's so pervasive in the world today. That's our responsibility. That's why we've been left here, is to be that salt, that preserving agent. Well, we're to also be light. Well, what does that mean? Well, light exposes, doesn't it? A light exposes the darkness and the dark corners. Let me ask you a question. If you've got company coming over to your house and you're cleaning up, what kind of light do you have on? You have bright light or dull light? You have bright light, don't you? You want to try to make sure you clean up all the cobwebs in the corner, all the dirt and dust that piles it up, right? You want bright light to help clean up, to help expose the dirt. Now, when that company comes over, what kind of light do you want to have? You want ambiance, right? You want a dimmer light so they don't see anything you might have missed, right? Well, Christians are to be the bright light, exposing the dark corners, exposing the dirt that's around us. But I'm afraid that too many of us have become so much like the world that we're kind of dull lights. We don't shed a lot of light on the world around us. We've become so much like the world that we're not influencing the world. We're not holding back that corruption. And we are commanded to do that, to be salt and light. Take your Bibles and turn to Esther chapter 4. I'm going to share an illustration from straight out of the Bible here. Esther's in the Old Testament, if you can find it. Now just listen to me. But Esther chapter 4, verse 14. There's a phrase in here that's probably the most familiar phrase out of Esther, but maybe the most familiar phrase, one of the more familiar phrases from the Bible. I need to give you a quick background on Esther. Esther was a Jewish girl taken into captivity. Her cousin Mordecai raised her as a godly young lady. When she became an adult, or at least an older teenager, the king went on a search for a new queen and brought all the single eligible women, paraded them before him so he could pick his new queen, and he picked Esther. He didn't even know she was a Jewish girl. He picked her to be his queen. And then there was another man, Haman, who was sort of like the prime minister, and Esther's cousin Mordecai refused to bow to Haman because Haman was a wicked man. Everyone else bowed to Haman, but he would not do so. And Haman tricked the king into a plot to sign a decree to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. Now, all the Jews were set to be killed on a particular day, but the queen herself was a Jew, unbeknownst to the king who had made the decree, or Haman, who tricked him into making it. So Mordecai goes to Esther, the queen. You have to understand, you can't think of a queen in this context as being somehow equal to the king. She was very much subservient to him. In fact, if she came to him without being called, she risked being put to death. And so Mordecai comes to her and tries to encourage her to go to the king to help save her people, the Jews. And she is, understandably, nervous about going before the king uncalled. And so in order to convince her, Mordecai says this in verse 14 to Esther. He says, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement or help and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed." Stop right there. What is he saying to Esther? He's saying, if you decide to keep quiet, to be silent, God will still deliver his people. God will still send help to his people. In other words, God is still sovereign. God is still in control. Even if you decide to sit and be quiet and not get involved and engage, God still has a purpose and a plan that he's going to work out. Well, I say that to you this morning. I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that God is going to do what he needs to do, even if we decide to sit on our hands, to sit on the sidelines, and not get engaged and involved. But look at the end of the verse. And this is the familiar passage. He says to her, "Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" What is he saying there? He's saying, Esther, how do you know that this isn't why God made you queen? This isn't the very reason why God put you in the position that he put you in. Well, looking back on it from our perspective, we see that's obviously why God put her there. But she doesn't see that. She doesn't know that. So he's trying to convince her that she needs to get engaged and get involved to make a difference and to have an influence. Well, I say that to you this morning. My message to you is not one of fear, where I say to you, if you don't get engaged and involved, then America's doomed. Well, maybe she is. I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. But I will say this. How do you know that God doesn't want to use you? How do you know that you're not in a place right now where God can use you to be a tremendous influence, holding back the corruption, exposing the darkness? Look, it might not be with politicians. It might be at your work, at your school, in your neighborhood, with your family. All I know is that God has commanded you to be salt and light, and you don't know whether God can use you unless you put yourself in a position to be used of God. You know, the whole theme of Esther is God's sovereignty and that God governs in the affairs of men. But let's take away from this that what a blessing it is to be used of God to accomplish his will. I have a book on my back table that's written by Tim Eppers. And in that book, it's called Real Citizenship, he gives an illustration of the time when he was on, I believe it was a Delta flight. He was flying somewhere, and on that flight, they sometimes have monitors all through the planes where they show some things, movies and other things. Well, they showed a music video that he thought was extremely inappropriate and objectionable to show to a whole plane full of people, kids and otherwise. So when he got back home, he wrote an email to Delta. And he said, I like the way he said this. He said, I think if you'll review this video, you'll see that it doesn't meet Delta's standards. In other words, he didn't say it doesn't meet my personal standards. He said, I don't think it's going to meet Delta's standards. Well, the first response he got was, very much a form letter. Thank you, Mr. Eccles, but blah, 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 blah. We're not going to do anything about it. So he wrote a second email. Got the same kind of response. Wrote a third email. And finally got a response from someone at Delta who could do something about it. And this was the response. It's not verbatim. Thank you, Mr. Eccles. We have reviewed the video in question, and you are right. It does not meet Delta standards, and it will be